Welcome. This is Eric Sinrod with Jonathan Armstrong, bringing you your most recent video podcast, TechLaw10. I'm with the law firm Dwayne Morris, based in San Francisco, as you can tell by the Golden Gate Bridge. So I think we're here to say happy birthday or happy anniversary to GDPR. On May 25th, GDPR will be a toddler, now fully on its legs and moving forward as a child, 5 years old. And Jonathan is an authority on this subject. So I'm going to pose a few questions to Jonathan, a little different format than usual. We have not practiced this, but he'll be perfect anyway. And let's see what he comes up with. So Jonathan, first, fines. Tell us about fines under GDPR over these last 5 years.
Yes, my sense is that you're letting me start with an easy one, but and we should have had party hats and we don't, but apologies. Fines, I think, is an interesting story. Obviously, fines have definitely stepped up in the last year, 18 months or so. We're recording this on the 18th. My prediction is that we'll have some more big news in birthday week about a large fine to come. We also then get the round robin from some of those regulators that don't report live, real-time statistics. So as we record it, we're sitting at around about 2.6 billion euros of fines. My prediction is that by birthday day, we'll be up to around 3.5 billion euros worth of fines. So that's significant. We're over the 2000 level. I think there was certainly in the early days less fines than people thought. Now, of course, fines have stepped up a gear, but there hasn't been that consistency that the European Commission had hoped for across the EU. I know that in my blog, the very first day that what became GDPR was announced, I said that this was going to be one of the biggest issues that the EU would have to face, and it hasn't really faced it at all. If you look at two countries that are geographically similar, I know Spain is bigger than Portugal, but they're similar in geographical location, similar history. 747 fines in Spain, just 8 in Portugal. So there are real differences across the EU. The budgets of DPAs are going up. That's leading to more fines. There's a recent survey that estimates that the budgets for DPAs are now 327 million euros across the EU. So that's likely to lead to increased enforcement as the regulators gear up. But maybe the final thing I'd say about fines is it's just not all about the money, as the great Jesse J said. There have been orders that have had really severe commercial consequences for organizations that haven't involved fines at all. You might look at, for example, the UK case ordering HMRC to destroy records. You might look at the ban for replica AI in Italy, the suspension for ChatGPT, the delay of Facebook launching dating. Fines wouldn't have hit an organization like Facebook at the time, but taking them out of the market for online dating during the pandemic, the gold rush for the online dating world, $1 billion market hit them more than a fine would have. So it's not just all about the money. The fines are obviously an integral part of GDPR.
Very well done. Yeah, and you've anticipated a few places I'm going to go.
Okay.
With this. Not surprisingly, but I'm not you don't need to respond to this part because I want to keep going. But I'm not a mathematician, but even just noodling it in my head, it sounds like you're believing there'll be some further significant fines even up until the 5th birthday of GDPR. I see you nodding your head. So let's talk about processing activities. We hear about the fines, they sort of make the news, but by using a data protection impact assessment, DPIA, at the outset of any potential data processing project, one would think that would be a smart thing to do. What guidance do you have along those lines?
I think it is a smart thing to do. I think when the initial proposals were made, it wasn't as smart as it is now. The original proposal was that there'd be a sort of prescribed form and some bureaucrat in Brussels would set out what he or she thought was the ideal procedure. That didn't happen. Organizations can work out a process that works for them. And in simple terms, they have to look at the risks in any processing activity that they're going to undertake. It's useful to remove risks. It's useful to ensure that you meet your transparency obligations, because transparency fines are predominant in GDPR. There's more transparency fines than there are for data security. So it helps organizations do all those things right, and it helps them put mitigation measures in place as well. So I am a fan of the DPIA process. Organizations should find out a process that works for them, but document these things and reduce risk.
Thank you. Third-party cookies. So we know that Firefox and Safari already are seeking to block their use. How do cookies interrelate vis-a-vis GDPR?
These are good questions. There are GDPR elements to cookies, and there are also elements from other EU laws. The e-privacy directive, it's sometimes called the cookies directive, which is going through a legislative change. There's obviously a lot of complaints from people like Max Schrems. There's a lot of complaints about some of the tools that are enabled through cookies, like Google Analytics, a new case on that today. And there are some GDPR issues with cookies as well. Again, around transparency. If you have a cookie on a website that you say is for security purposes, but you're really gathering data to sell it to advertisers, then that's not okay in GDPR terms if you haven't disclosed that secondary use to people. And in some cases, the secondary use is actually the primary use, because that's the one that's making money. So cookies is a real area of risk for organizations. And from my experience, organizations don't take the care they should to work out the cookies that are on their website. Big tech are a large part of the story. Some of the analytics applications, for example, some of the advertising relating cookies are stored in perpetuity. Some of them are stored for long periods of time, some for slightly weird periods of time, like 1 year, 24 days, and 8 hours. It's hard to work out what is the justification for some of these periods. And obviously the onus is on the website owner. If you have a website, you've got to check that the cookies on your site are legit. Even if they're third-party cookies, even if those cookies come from widgets that you've installed on your website, you have to look at what the cookie's doing, where the data's going, how long it's being kept for. And if you can't do that, you can expect a knock on the door from the likes of Max Schrems. And if you don't answer him and the requests that they're automating and sending for corporations, then you can expect a knock on the door from a regulator shortly after.
Very good. So far, you're passing the exam. We're on to
okay, that's good.
We're on to the next question. So,
do I get some sort of diploma?
You'll get a cookie.
All right.
So, in any event, everybody these days now is talking about AI, and I don't want to pat us on the back too much, but we were discussing that quite a while ago in these video podcasts. But here we are. In fact, now the interest level has gotten high enough that there's concerns that the train's out of the station too fast, the genie out of the bottle. You can come up with other metaphors. Worries that perhaps social media wasn't regulated sufficiently early. We've even been having some congressional hearings in Washington, D.C. in the United States about what to do about AI. So my question for you, sir, is tell us about AR. Sorry, excuse me, not AR. See, you can tell I'm not a bot because I made a mistake. Or maybe I am a bot because I made a mistake. But tell us about GDPR and AI, please.
I think one of the things that, I've criticized GDPR since day one, but I've tried to be balanced in that criticism. And one of the things I think GDPR has done okay with is adapting to new technology. And we've had quite a few cases that have involved AI. We've had cases like Clearview that have looked at facial recognition as well, cases that have looked at things like Ring doorbells. So GDPR has adapted to technology that wasn't invented 7 years ago when GDPR was passed. And it's the same with AI as well. We've talked on these podcasts before about, for example, the Garante, the Italian Data Protection Authority, and its activity over food delivery. We've talked about the ban for replica AI, again in Italy, the suspension of ChatGPT. And the ChatGPT suspension is perhaps just a really interesting example of the extraterritorial reach of GDPR. You know, ChatGPT was suspended by the Italian authorities. Initially, ChatGPT was saying almost, this isn't anything to do with us. We're not an entity, so we can't be suspended. It's business as usual. Then within a couple of hours, we had the CEO of ChatGPT, tweeting, saying Italy was one of his favorite countries and he liked Italian food. And then he did whatever the Italian is for a complete volte-face by knocking on the door of the regulator, agreeing to meet, I think, within 24 hours, agreeing a series of measures to make the regulator more happy. And then eventually the suspension was lifted. So you've gone from an organization that's US-based that almost thinks it can't be touched by GDPR, at least initially, to going that complete about turn, listening to the regulators' concerns and making changes, not just for the Italian bit of ChatGPT, but looking at changes across the board as a result. So in that respect, GDPR is probably punched above its weight, really. And I think that's partly because people like investors care as well. Obviously, Microsoft is a big investor in OpenAI. Whether or not they had any input into that decision or that change of heart is interesting. But we know that boards, we know that non-executive directors, we know that investors care about GDPR compliance, and we know that auditors too as well. I've cases where we're asked questions by the auditors on the progress of the case, and that goes to value. And even if organizations don't care about GDPR, don't care about privacy, don't care about data protection, they do care about money and investment. And that's sometimes the way that GDPR embeds itself into a business through the back door, really.
Right. And as you said earlier, it's not all about the money, but people do care about the money. You're 4 for 4. There are 2 more questions on your exam.
Okay.
So far, you're passing, folks. So that's good to know. So let's talk about the complex global ecosystem. In response to GDPR, other countries and jurisdictions have introduced and enacted updated privacy legislation. Even here in California, we have the California Consumer Privacy Act, which mirrors some aspects of GDPR, but that's not the case elsewhere. We have somewhat of a tapestry. What are your thoughts about that in relation to GDPR?
Well, I think there's good and there's bad, isn't there? I think GDPR has driven up standards in some other countries, and that's partly because politicians thought it was a good idea. It's partly because there was voter demand and there were votes in it. It's partly because of the economics that countries were trying to get an adequacy status from the EU, and they had to raise their standards to get that adequacy status. But at the same time, we are seeing some fracturing, and we're also seeing some nation states use GDPR-like reasoning to really get at data sovereignty. We can all think of countries that have more repressive regimes where they almost try and use data protection as a reason for being more repressive. There's an interesting piece, isn't there, about for example, the US criticizing China for many years for the way in which China banned some technologies that originated from the US. And then the US hits against TikTok on the basis of its connection to China. And there's a sense of irony in a lot of that. And the worry is, of course, that these nation state interests will become just really difficult for cross-border trade and for cross-border commerce. If every country tweaks the system slightly and insists that it is right, then that leads to an awful lot of administration for businesses, an awful lot of bureaucracy for very little benefit.
5 for 5. Okay, your last question. So I
Okay.
mentioned at the outset that GDPR is almost 5. It's going to have its birthday, and we're going to have celebration with hats and cake and candles and all that. Where do you see things with GDPR and related matters 5 years from now?
Well, that's a really good question.
Yeah, well, I've been warming you up. I asked you the more straightforward one first on fines. I'm buying you some time right now.
Yeah, thanks. I think in some respects there'll be more of the same. So transparency, data protection by design, all of that sort of stuff will be a real area of concentration. I think there is concern about that disparity I talked about, Spain versus Portugal, for example. You could pick other pair countries and make the same point. And there are some who say that as a result, enforcement should go to the European Commission, or it should go to some central European data police force rather than have in-country regulators. Will that happen in the next 5 years? Probably not. I sort of hope not, because one of the attractions of GDPR is that it reflects what people in a particular country care about. Europe doesn't think the same because of the history. People in Austria care more about dental records because of the history of the horrendous things that happened in the Holocaust. And you don't want to take that away from people. So the more you centralize, I think, the more you don't address people's concerns about things that matter most to them. So I don't think within the next 5 years we'll see some centralized body, but I think we will see more coordination. I think we will see the European Data Protection Board step up to the plate more. I think we're likely to hear news about that in the next 48 hours, the next 72 hours, if the rumors I hear are true. So there will be a willingness to drive consistency. I think that good regulators will continue to use GDPR in a somewhat inventive way to look at new technology. I think one of the real concerns that we have there is about the professionalization of regulators. As I said, they've got more resources, but some regulators are still not following proper process. If we are at something like 3.5 million euros by birthday, billion euros by birthday date, I'll make another wild prediction and say that 2.2, 2.3, 2.4 billion euros of that will be under appeal. And that's not healthy for the system either, when the majority of fines levied are being appealed. Now, some of those fines are being appealed just because it's opportunist, or because it delays awkward decisions, or it enables stock markets to catch up with the news. But some of them are being appealed because regulators didn't follow the proper procedure. And what we've learned is that if you have the power to fine to such a large degree, to have such a consequential impact on a business by stopping it processing, then you ought to follow the right procedure. We can't have regulators with real powers behaving in a tin pot manner and not following the proper rules and procedures. So I'd hope that in 5 years' time, we'll have much more of a recognition from regulators that if they're quasi prosecutors, they better follow the proper rules of natural justice and process, and they can't do things quickly and on the cheap.
Well, bravo to you. You were 6 for 6. I want to assure the audience that, first of all, Jonathan did not even know in advance that I was going to interview him like this,
No,
much less ask him questions, much less have him know what the questions were. I came up with them literally right beforehand, so there was no way he could have known, and he acquitted himself well. I believe we've been together like this about 300 times. This is the first time. This is our first time doing an interview format.
it is.
I think it worked well, primarily because you're so able.
Thank you.
And then otherwise, I forgot to say congratulations. You now have a new king since we last spoke.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
How about
Yeah.
that?
Long live King Charles. Yeah. Thanks. This was fun and completely unexpected. I would have prepared more, but then it's more fun if you don't prepare, isn't it? So
You don't need to prepare. All right. Well, thanks, folks. I'm Eric Sinrod at Dwayne Morris. You can reach me at ejsinrod@dwaynemorris.com.
I'm Jonathan Armstrong, jonathan.armstrong@corderycompliance.com. Thanks for listening. Hope that's been engaging. We'll try and post links to some of the cases that we talked about along the bottom of the screen. Do subscribe to our channel, like the podcast, etc., if you feel able to. And we'll speak to you again in a few weeks' time. Thanks for watching/listening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.